If you want to support the Murder Diaries and listen ad-free for $2.99 a month, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. You can also search the Murder Diaries ad-free on Spotify.
Bob Crane starred as Colonel Robert E. Hogan, the lead of Hogan's Heroes, an American television sitcom airing from 1965 to 1971. It was set in a prisoner of war camp in Nazi Germany during World War II. He was murdered on June 29, 1978, in Scottsdale, Arizona. The crime remains unsolved to this day. Today on the Murder Diaries, we're speaking with Bob Crane's official biographers, Carol Ford and Linda Groundwater. Together, we discuss Bob's life, career, and unsolved murder, and how he went from a middle-class kid born in Waterbury, Connecticut, to a Hollywood star and the lead of Hogan's Heroes. Now, here's our conversation.
Welcome, Carol, and welcome, Linda. Thank you so much for being here today. If you don't mind, introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having us. My name is Carol Ford, and I am one of 3 official biographers on Bob Crane, the definitive biography. I share that honor with Linda Groundwater and our 3rd contributor, Dee Young, our 3rd co-author. And I am a Senior Director of Editorial Services at a publishing firm here in southern New Jersey, near Philadelphia. And I have written, in addition to Bob's biography, I've written and published several other books and short stories, and have a podcast of my own. So thank you so much for having us.
And I am Linda Groundwater. I am currently living in Australia, but I did grow up in New England. I have an honors degree in communications and English and worked as a radio journalist and broadcaster for a few years in New England before coming down here to Australia. And I joined Carol on her podcast, as well as being the person who started this serious push to get this biography of Bob done.
I'll just also add that Dee Young, our 3rd biographer of Bob, she is a former employee of WICC and Weeby Radio in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She actually met Bob back in 1976 when Bob Crane visited the station to help the station celebrate its 50th anniversary. Dee has huge outreach in Connecticut radio, which, as we get going in our conversation, you'll learn that Bob, of course, had a tremendous career in radio in Connecticut. So, just wanted to make sure that we got Dee in there as well.
We appreciate that. What got you and Dee so invested in Bob's life and story?
There's just a story to tell when it comes to Bob. And for me, I know Carol had long been interested in the life of Bob Crane. For me, it was a later interest. I knew about Hogan's Heroes and I knew the show and I knew that he'd been murdered, and all of that happened when I was much younger. However, back in 2002, 2003, I came across the show again, remembered that these things had happened when I was younger, and decided to look up and learn a little bit more to see if I could refresh my memory. But what I found was that there was a huge story that was not being told because it was overshadowed by these things that had happened to him that were out of his control. And so I thought there needs to be a bit of focus put onto the whole story of Bob Crane. And as a journalist, I just said, I've got to do this. And I started. And as Carol mentioned before we started the podcast, I just went out onto Yahoo groups in different areas and said, hey, I need to get people who might know anything about this. And remember, by the time we started this, Bob had been dead for 25 years. So it was always going to be a case of who could tell us what we needed to know or what we wanted to know decades after he had already passed. But we were very lucky because Dee Young, our 3rd, did come in very, very early in the piece. She is the one who actually got me to Bob's cousin, his first cousin, Jim Senich, who became a great supporter and cheerleader for us. And eventually we were led through him and others into the whole of Bob's life. And Carol came in late 2005 as part of one of those Yahoo groups. And she can tell you how she was already involved in doing some work as well.
Sure. Yeah. just very quickly it was one of the shows that I loved as a kid, as a teenager. I'd watch it on in Philly here. It would be on UHF Channel 17. And I just really loved the show. Found out that Bob Crane had been murdered. And, for my little 14, 15-year-old self, that was just really tragic. And so other kids were going to the movies. I was asking my mom and dad to take me to the local library so I could go and research Bob in my very, very young way. But what I started doing was compiling kind of like that early bits of interest, early bits of research. And you fast forward to 2005 and Linda comes on board or onto the Yahoo groups, and I see what she's doing. And I'm looking at this, little pile that I had over here from when I was a kid. And, I knew it was a huge undertaking. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, good luck with that. Because, the things that were out there about Bob Crane were not the most pleasant things to read. And it was really kind of depressing to see all of that. And so we didn't know anything about him going into this, and we didn't know what we were going to find out. And as we get more into this, we'll discuss his sexual addiction, which he admitted, which he was seeking help for. We don't know what he had going on with his first or second wife. There's talk that they had an open marriage in both cases. Regardless of that, they both knew and they accepted it. And it's not our business to judge it. We get a lot of people judging him for cheating on his wives. And, that's not our business. But knowing that he was seeking help and knowing that he admitted it was an addiction, that really laid the foundation for us to continue this project, because if it had been anything different, we would not have.
And when we began this project too, Carol, you kind of touched on it, but it's important to know that we didn't know what we were going to be told. And
exactly
we didn't
right.
know that it was going to become a 600 plus page story. We didn't know how much there was to tell. But as we worked and started to gain people's trust, that people would bring other people to us. And they would, so-and-so knows about this, or so-and-so has never talked to anybody about this, or we'd find a thing that I remember distinctly preparing for an interview that I was absolutely sure, this would be the Canadian broadcasting one, Carol, that we were absolutely sure we knew what the tone of the interview was going to be, only to find out that the information we were basing the questions on that I had prepared, the information was completely erroneous, and that's being polite. It was a pack of lies. And so what it became was, we have to go and talk to 4 people about this now and find out what really happened versus what was told. So everything that we thought was a small thing became a much bigger thing, because there was so much information out there and so much of it was just wrong, that it became a quest, so to speak, for truth, good or bad. Bob wasn't a saint, and nobody's going to pretend that he was. He had flaws the same way we all do, and he had some pretty big ones, but they were still just human flaws.
I'm understanding now why the word definitive is in the title. I'd also like to offer some context for our listeners and pose it to you both as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you interviewed over 200 people.
The hundreds of people that we did talk with, Linda touched on it with earning their trust, because a lot of them had been burned by all of the misinformation and all of the lies, the flat out lies. And when they got to know who we were and realized that what we were doing was trying to tell his true story, they would say things to us like, "We're in this with you. How can we help you?" Arlene Martell, who was a guest star on Hogan's Heroes, she played T'Pring, Spock's bride on Star Trek. Arlene was one of our very, very first. And to say we were nervous is an understatement, because, these are kind of our idols too. We grew up watching and we really like these people. We want to impress them, but we also want to learn from them. And Arlene was very kind of not sure. But once we got into our conversation with her, by the end of it, she was, "What can I do to help? I'm going to call Robert Clary, and I'm going to call Bernard Fox, and I'm going to call this one, and I'm going to call that one. And what can I do?" And that's how so many of them became when they got to know, and it kind of built on each other. So when Arlene tells other people, hey, they're good, they're on the up and up, you can trust them, then that lent more credibility. So the more we built, the more it gained momentum, to the point where then we could approach his family members, his children, not Jim, because Jim came on early, but his son Scott and his daughter Karen, they've contributed. And Scott, who is the son from Bob's second wife, Patricia Olson, who is Sigrid Valdis from, that's her stage name, from Hogan's Heroes, played Hilda. We have 100% full and total support from the estate in everything that we do. So everything, he trusts us completely and gives us carte blanche approval for what we do, because that's how much trust we have.
And that's actually something that we typically do. We typically speak with the victim's family as close to the victim as possible in the cases we cover. But because both of you have worked alongside Bob's loved ones and have clearly earned that trust from so many of them, that's why we feel comfortable talking to you about his case and who he was as a person. And just hearing that number up in the 200s of people that you've interviewed, it must have been such an incredible experience, but massive undertaking as well, because that's a lot of people to interview.
It was a journey.
It was huge.
Yeah.
But also it was fun. Like it was scary because sometimes, I mean, you knew the caliber and the level of people that you were dealing with. The Al Ruddy story, which I won't go into here, sticks out in my mind. There was a series about him just on Netflix recently.
The Godfather,
he was the producer of The Godfather. Yeah, one of the creators of Hogan's Heroes and producer of The Godfather and Man Called My House. And Maureen Arthur, who was huge on Broadway and movies and television. And Gary Owen, who every child I ever knew grew up with as the voice of Sesame Street and Laugh-In. And these people were people that we had in our minds, in our childhood, in our consciousness, that I go, oh my God, I'm going to talk to Gary Owen. Okay, it's 2:00 in the morning, but I'm going to talk to Gary Owen, and it's fine. And to try and have a rational conversation 2 a.m. is fascinating on its own. I want you to know, but to try and dig things out of people who start out a bit reluctant, because a lot of the people we spoke to were very protective of Bob, only because, as Carol said, were so sick of hearing just the horrible things. Was there truth to some of the horrible things? Of course there was. And was he murdered? Absolutely, of course he was. But the Bob they knew was not the Bob that was out there. And when they had been spoken to before, either their words were twisted or they were ignored. The cast and family of Hogan's Heroes was asked when Bob died to, go on television and talk about him. But they made a pact that they would only talk about the Bob they knew, the good stuff. They didn't want to talk about his murder. They didn't want to talk about sex. They didn't know a lot of that stuff. And even if they did, that wasn't the Bob that they knew in their everyday lives. And no one took them up on it. When they understood that what we wanted was a real story and the real Bob, they just relaxed. And by the time we got to the ends of conversations, like Carol said, it was, we're in this with you. You know what? I know someone else who can talk to you. They were just afraid. It took those first few brave people to come forward. Bob's cousin, Arlene. 5 years it took us to get Robert Clary, who kept saying no, 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 including to Arlene. And eventually it was, okay, we're going to tell you what you know, what we know. And some of it may be good and some of it may be not, but we're going to be honest with you. And they trusted us to handle it respectfully, regardless of whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah, it was a true journey. It was an absolute journey. And writing the book in and of itself was one thing, but the research and going through all of that with the people from Bob's inner circle and his colleagues and his best friends and his school friends. And, it just painted this whole picture of Bob Crane complete. Now, we're not writing a memoir. We can't know what his children knew sitting around the Christmas tree or at birthday parties. But that's not what this book was. This book was from birth to death, told by hundreds of people, every facet of his life, who knew him and who knew him very well, and in some cases better than most.
This is a perfect spot to rewind just a bit and ask you to tell us a little bit about who Bob was in the context of this book.
Bob Crane is known for three things. He's known for Colonel Hogan. He was a sexual addict, but in everyday language, people think of him as a pervert or a creep. And he was a murder victim. He is more than Hogan. He's more than a murder victim. He is more than a sexual addict. Bob Crane was a very talented musician. He was a drummer. He was a drummer since the age of 10 years old. Drums were something that went with him all the way until the very, very night he died. He carried his drumsticks with him. He was phenomenal in radio. His radio colleagues called him a radio genius. And a lot of people don't know about his radio career. And it's one of my favorite areas of his life to talk about, because what he did in radio was so cutting edge and so out of the box thinking. And he changed how radio was being done. But people don't know that. And they don't care to know that, because they are so laser focused on murder, and they're so laser focused on sex. He was an actor who did not want to go into a television talk show format. He was offered Jack Paar, went to Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, but he didn't want that. He wanted to be an actor. And so he starts really trying to learn about being an actor. He takes courses from Stella Adler. He really tries to hone acting skills. And then he gets his big break on Hogan's Heroes. And nobody really knew him before that. And then suddenly everybody knew him. And then after Hogan's Heroes, he becomes typecast, and he still wants to act, but unfortunately he is still Colonel Hogan, and he remains Colonel Hogan almost until he dies. And he was just breaking out of that typecasting when he's murdered. And he was really starting to hone those acting skills and do some really good, serious drama. He was a father. He was a cousin. He was a very loyal friend. He was somebody who did a lot for different charities. He was very philanthropic. He gave of his time. He was always giving to different charities like Cerebral Palsy Foundation and Armed Forces Radio Network. He was constantly going and doing, spots on the fly. So there is so much, and that's kind of like your quick penny tour of who Bob Crane was and who he was not. But in a nutshell, he was more than Hogan, murder, and sex.
I love that you bring that up, because that's also something that we struggle with when we cover the cases that we do on the Murder Diaries. A lot of times it's difficult to find anything about the victim other than maybe their job title and where they were killed and all the details about their murder. And they were so much more than that. They were people. They were multifaceted. No one is just black and white. There's a lot of gray in the people and cases that we cover. And so it's really nice that you're able to shine a light on someone like Bob Crane, who may have been misunderstood for a quarter of a century after his death. And now you're reminding the public, no, this was a man that was so much more than these three things.
And I just want to follow up with that too. He was just a human being. People think of him as kind of a cartoon character who they can poke fun of and laugh at and, oh, ha, 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 but he was human. And there isn't a human alive who is perfect. He was not perfect, but for some very odd reason, people seem to think Bob Crane should be and will always be the butt of jokes. And it's very tragic, because he was a victim of murder, and yet he is continually ridiculed because of the fact that it came out about his sexual proclivities, and the addiction only came out later. People didn't know that until much later. And really when Linda and Dee and I started really diving in with our research.
And you may see this in your own work, but when people talk about murder victims, they have this tendency to look somehow to blame the person who was murdered. There must be a reason. If they can't find the person who did it, or if they find there's somebody who is mad, well, they shouldn't have done that. I'm not sure that means that someone should be dead.
Victim blaming. Absolutely.
Do you find that
rampant.
a lot? I would suspect there's got to be tons of and with Bob, there's tons of victim blaming because there was sex involved. This is definitely, I would say, one of the worst that I have seen, where they go, well, what was he expecting? He deserved that. But, they make fun of him on TV. They made fun of him on the TV show Frasier, and it's hurtful. His family are very hurt when these things, and the things that, when I went back to the States last year, I met up with Bob's younger son, Scott, and also with his daughter, Karen, and they are beautiful people. I love his children. And the things that people have said to their faces about their father, because obviously these people know better than these kids who grew up with this man who who represented a certain love and attachment to them. But by all means, go say to his daughter, well, he was asking for it. Would it even occur to you to speak like that to someone who's the child of a murder victim? It wouldn't to me. But in Bob's case, there is just so much victim blaming that people have taken that superiority stance and decided that it's okay to say that even to people whom they, who loved him.
If you've heard about prescription GLP-1s, which truly who hasn't by now, you've probably heard that they're super effective or even seen someone's results. My own doctor and I had a quick conversation about them just because they're everywhere and I was curious about what's going on with them. And even she mentioned how effective they are. These things work. But here's the thing. It can be confusing how exactly one in need might get a GLP-1 prescription. They're also kind of expensive. This is where Ro comes in.
Ro gives you access to prescription compounded GLP-1s with the same weight loss ingredient as brand name GLP-1s at a fraction of the cost. Plus, they're in stock and you can get them in 1 to 4 days if you qualify. Ro members have support throughout the process, and if you're eligible for medication, patients have access to their provider on demand for any questions.
The coolest part is you can see if you qualify from your own home. There's no need to wait for an appointment or try and find your way around a new medical office.
Go to ro.co/Murder Diaries. Memberships start at just $99 for your first month. Medication costs are separate. That's ro.co/Murder Diaries.
Go to ro.co/safety for black box warning and full safety info. Compounded medication is not required to and does not receive FDA review or approval. Prescription only. It's my understanding that, sexual addiction or hypersexual disorder, if you will, isn't actually currently included in the diagnostic statistical model. So I know a lot of those types of things are in question in terms of what those types of behaviors are and how to classify them. But we know a lot of those types of behaviors can stem from things like unhealed traumas and things like that. I'm not here to name that for Bob, but in your discoveries in all of your interviews, did you discover anything like that in Bob's life that may have led to some of these more maybe destructive behaviors?
So we actually, in all of this, we talked with Bob's counselor. He was a man who was affiliated with the Windmill Dinner Theater out in Scottsdale. The Windmill Dinner Theater was not just in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was actually in other parts of the country, in Dallas, Texas, in Denver, Colorado. And this man was actually a minister with the United Church of Christ. And part of what his role was with the church was to actually go to a theater group, and the Windmill Dinner Theater chain was the group that he went to help these actors who were traveling very much. And they were on the road. And he didn't make a big deal out of who he was as a minister. To the actors, he was the guy who opened the theater every night, handed out the paychecks, made sure that the housing was good for all of the actors. But he was not known to them as Reverend Ed Beck. He was just known as Ed Beck. And when Bob started to have the very strong desire to break out of this addiction, and Reverend Beck was working with him, and it was private. It wasn't, you have to remember the time. This is 1978. It's not like today where people who say, hey, I have an addiction, I need to go and check in and I need help. And there's a rallying that happens today around people who acknowledge their addictions, and as it should be. But in 1978, you didn't have that. What you had in that era was the Betty Ford Clinic for people who had trouble with drinking. You didn't have the mental health resources that are available today. Now, that doesn't mean that our mental health resources are perfect. They aren't, but they are there in a way that they were not in the late 1970s when Bob was starting to come to terms. And the reason he was coming to terms is that he wanted to be a better father to his children. He knew that his children, they were hearing things in school, they were hearing things out and about, and they're in Hollywood, so they're hearing other people talk. He had lost his job with Disney because he was going to topless bars, and that's not Disney-like behavior. And so they're starting to ask him questions that he feels he can't answer truthfully and still consider himself a good father. So he is looking, he's searching. And so he happens to ask somebody at the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona, the month that he is murdered. Hey, I'm looking to talk to somebody. Can you recommend anybody? He says, yeah, talk to Ed Beck. And he goes, Ed Beck, why Ed Beck? Oh, well, didn't you know he's a counselor? And so that then opens up this line of communication between Reverend Beck and Bob Crane. And Reverend Beck gave us really deep insight into those conversations that he had with Bob throughout those final weeks leading up to Bob's life. And they're very, very insightful. And I can see Linda's putting her glasses on because I think she's pulling up some passages that she's going to read. But before she does that, I want to say, too, that not only did we talk to Reverend Beck, but we also, because we're not psychologists, we are not well-versed in the field of psychology. We only know what Reverend Beck told us. And so to try and get a better understanding of what sexual addiction is, what this deviation is, we did talk to other members of the psychological community who specialize in sexual addiction, in men's sexual health. One of the most profound ones was, and it's a connection that I have from the work that I do. I work in healthcare publishing, and one of the peer-reviewed scientific journals that I work on is urologic nursing. And the current editor of that journal is Dr. Suzanne Qualick. And I asked her, and I said, can you talk to me a little bit about, because she is an expert on men's sexual health as what she does in her daily job every day. And she said something really profound because, we can sit here and say, oh, Bob had an addiction, but going back to consensual sex, she says society, and this is coming from Dr. Qualick, society looks in on the private world of sexuality and deems something abnormal, where the man does not automatically identify his behavior as illness or disease. So I'll pass this over to Linda now to continue on with some of Reverend Beck's stuff.
No, you're quite okay. I'm just fishing through here, and I was looking at what people were saying about Bob in general as a personality, and it was his son Scott who said, he was ridiculously friendly to his fans, and Ed Beck, the Reverend Beck, had said to us, the charisma, the magnetism that Bob had was, it was both a blessing and a curse. As an actor, you want people to really, really like you. As Sally Field once said, they really, really like me. Bob was incredibly likable and had a huge likability score, even when he didn't have a series. And if he walked into a room, the Reverend Beck told us that, it didn't matter. Men, women, dogs, everyone just immediately attracted to Bob. He was friendly. He was personable. He had zero human judgment, by the way. He could not tell you if a person was good or bad. Everybody was good. He was and he said this in one of his very last interviews. I'm the guy who always thinks there's a pony in the other room. He's also the guy who thinks every human being is amazing and they must have something good about them. And it took a lot of talk with people like the Reverend Beck to go, hey, these people are not good for you. You need to cut this out of your life if you want to be able to recover. And as the Reverend Beck had told us, He wasn't a sex counselor, an addiction counselor, but he understood addiction and how it worked in general. Craig Necken, who wrote The Addictive Personality, was talking about, there is a point where the person just breaks down under the stress and the pain produced by the addiction, where acting out no longer produces that much pleasure. And the pleasure that Bob had originally gotten from having sex. And by the way, his addiction did not start in Hollywood. He wasn't a Hollywood bad boy, good boy turned bad boy thing. His addiction started, or his acting out, which developed into an addiction, started back in the 50s when he was still in Connecticut. And it became overshadowed by the fact that he was losing jobs. He was being talked about. His children were asking questions. And as the Reverend Beck said, it was just a matter of, there were some things you're doing, Bob, that are not good for you, and they're not good for your family. And Bob understood himself to be a bad husband. He wanted to be a good husband, but he knew that he wasn't. And he wanted to be a good father. And in some ways he was, but he knew that he wasn't, because he was being affected by this addiction. And so he finally took that step to say, we need to do something. I need to stop, but I know that I cannot do it by myself. I must have help.
I can hear the care and the defense that you have and are presenting for Bob. And it's so great that posthumously he has two wonderful people on his side, because his murder is still unsolved. And of course, in being part of the true crime community and being a true crime podcast, we do want to highlight and create awareness of his murder. Can you talk to us about June 29th, 1978? What did you find out, and what are your beliefs as to what happened, what's going on, and why is it still unsolved?
Yeah, it's actually the early morning of June 29th, probably around 4:00 in the morning, local Scottsdale time. The night before, June 28th, Bob he was in town in Scottsdale performing his play Beginner's Luck, which is an absolute hilarious play. He was one of the original stars of it. He also became, over time, the director and the producer of it. He would write to the playwrights, and he was always making changes to it, and it became his play. So he was in Scottsdale performing Beginner's Luck. He was not entirely happy with the way that this particular run was going. People who told us about having seen this particular run in Scottsdale shortly before his murder said that it was good. He was great, but he himself actually made audio recordings of one of the performances, which we have. And on the tape, he writes disaster and bomb. He was very unhappy with some of the acting that was going on in this particular play. But the night of June 28th, it actually went well from the accounts that we had heard. And he was very optimistic. And about a week before his murder, he had given a local interview with a local newspaper reporter. And he was talking about other projects that he had in the works. He was talking about his separation from his second wife. And he was very sad about that. But there are reports that they were trying to reconcile. He does not say that to the reporter, but from many different accounts, he and his second wife, Patty, were looking at reconciliation. He was very optimistic in this interview with the reporter, and he was talking about the possibility of even writing his own book. And he said if he was going to write his biography, my autobiography, I would call it Laughing All the Way to the Grave. And this is a week before he's murdered. So he is actually in a pretty good place. He's got some stuff that he's working on with his addiction, with his second marriage, but he is optimistic. He's looking toward the future. And when you hear people say he was washed up, he didn't have anything going on, he was depressed, he was brooding, he had a dark side, there was none of that. He was just human with basic human emotions. So he was optimistic. The night of June 28th, he does the show. It goes well. His friend, John Carpenter, is there. Now, John Carpenter is different from the movie director. He goes by John Henry Carpenter. He's now since passed. He was a man of Native American descent, and he was a hanger-on. A lot of sources will call John Carpenter Bob's best friend. That is an exaggeration. He was not his best friend. He was an enabler. He was someone that would carouse with Bob. They'd go on the prowl looking for women. He often traveled to the different cities and met Bob in these different cities so that after the show ended, for whichever play he was doing, they would go off to the bars and the nightclubs and look for women. Bob did not drink or smoke, but that's where they would end up. So John Carpenter was there the night of June 28th after Bob signed autographs, and he always loved to come out of the theater. And Bob loved his fans, absolutely adored his fans. He would stand in the lobby of the theater signing autographs to whoever wanted an autograph. When that was finished, he and John Carpenter leave together. They go around back to where Bob's car was parked, and there's a flat tire on the car. And what some people think may have been was a failed first attempt on Bob's life, although that is unproven. They get the flat tire fixed at a garage not far from the theater. And they proceed then to go to a diner, Bobby McGee's diner, where waitresses hear Bob and John Carpenter having what some have called a heated discussion or an argument. They were not having a pleasant conversation. And while people don't really know exactly the specifics of the conversation, it did not look to be one where either party was happy. And the speculation is made that Bob was telling John Carpenter that he had to no longer hang out with him because he was breaking out of this lifestyle, and he was doing what Reverend Beck had been telling him to do, which was cut away these people, these enablers. And John Carpenter was certainly one of them. They end up going then back to his condo or apartment at Winfield Place in Scottsdale, which that was the apartment that was rented for Bob. The rest of the cast and crew had different lodgings, but he, being the star, had a bit nicer accommodations. And John Carpenter is there for a bit. There is a phone call that happens between Bob and his second wife, Patty. Neighbors in the condo of Bob's heard him yelling. They don't know who he was yelling to, but it was just him. And to the point where those neighbors said to each other, if he keeps this up, he's not going to be able to perform tomorrow night in the show. The night goes on. John Carpenter apparently leaves. According to his testimony, he leaves. Bob goes to bed and never, that's it. That's all we know from that point on. Now, what the police have said, what the evidence is that the door was unlocked. Bob never kept the door unlocked. He was very, very vigilant about locking the door, making sure everything was locked. So it was very unusual for the door to have been unlocked. And somewhere around that 4:00 in the morning area of June 29th, it was a Thursday morning, somebody who is either in the apartment already or has access to the apartment. In either case, it's very likely that he knew the person. It was determined by forensic science that it could not have been a woman. So a man was in there either with him at the time or was able to let himself in. And when Bob was asleep, he hit him over the head with what police believe was one of the camera tripods, because of the way the indentation was made in his skull, matched what a camera tripod head would have looked like. And then also the outline of blood on the sheets where a tripod had been laying. They never did recover the murder weapon, but they believe, based on that information, that it was a camera tripod. Bob was sleeping. He was on his side. He never knew what hit him, which is a blessing, because the first swing came down right behind his ear. And the first one most likely did not kill him, but did enormous brain damage, so that even if he were alive, it would have just been clinically. It would not have been, he would not have at that point known what was happening. The second blow actually did him in. Whoever did murder him went beyond the actual death blows and symbolically tied a cord around his neck post-mortem and in a bow as a symbol. And then also there was what police found and what some speculate to be dried semen on his upper thigh, where it was a white flaky substance. Of course, this is 1978. There is no DNA. There is nothing advanced. And so there is no way of knowing if that's what that was. And so Bob is murdered. There's blood all over the room, blood spatter all over the room. There's a handprint on the curtain where whoever it was looked out to see if there was anybody in the parking lot, and whoever it was let themselves out. The next morning, Victoria Berry Wells, who was one of the cast members, had an engagement with Bob to go over some demo work, some voiceover work with Bob, because he was helping her with a pilot, with some work for her, because she was an actress and she was starring in the show with him. And he failed to meet her, which was unlike him. Bob was a very early riser, and he failed to make their appointment. So not only that, but he also had an engagement with a luncheon that afternoon, that early or late afternoon, early morning as well. Victoria Berry Wells goes to the apartment to check on him because this is not like him. And she lets herself into his apartment. She's surprised that the door is open, not locked. She lets herself in. It's completely dark. And she goes into the bedroom, and what she sees is somebody lying on the bed. And because of the way the blood spatter was, it looked like a woman with long dark hair. And so she comes running out and she calls 911 and she calls the police and she says, "You've got to come quickly. Somebody is dead in Bob Crane's apartment." And that is where the police come and the investigation starts.
It honestly sounds like such a personal and horrific murder.
Yeah, very, very personal.
It makes me wonder if there was anyone besides John Carpenter that had any ill will toward him.
Well, there are this many theories, and some are already disproven, but people insist on them, and some are not. But there's something interesting to add in here. Two things. One is that Bob did not drink, and there was open alcohol found in the condo when he was killed. Now, he didn't mind other people drinking, but somebody else had been drinking, and the alcohol was left open. And of course, that wasn't looked into. And the important thing here is to understand that the police made an absolute mess of the crime scene. So if there was any chance that they were going to find the killer, it was not going to be by using the crime scene. They let people walk in and out. They let people use the phone. They let people take things away. They lost things. They smoked in there. And there's video of the crime scene. And sadly, it was actually shown on television as part of Autopsy: The Last Hours of, and I can't imagine watching that if I was a member of Bob's family. But they left the body there for a fair amount of time, of course, so as they were going in and out. And you could see the medical examiner crawling all over the bed where the body was. So right where the murderer would have been, because it had to be immensely close up. This was not a distance murder. This was a close-up and personal bludgeoning. The medical examiner then climbed up on the bed. They moved Bob around. They cut his hair while he was in the bed. Reverend Beck is not a little guy. He was a Marine. He was in Vietnam. He was like
7 feet tall. He was
huge.
Yeah.
He was huge. Very strong, had gone through all kinds of things. And I say this because they asked him to be the one who identified the body on the bed. Now, again, didn't even wait for the morgue. Please come and identify this body in the bed. And what they did, because the side of Bob was on his side when he was killed. So you only had one side of his face, and it was covered in blood. Presumably the face would have swollen, and it wouldn't have been, the pictures that we see, you can't see all of that, but you can clearly see that one side is all covered with blood. So in order for him to identify Bob, what they did was they tied ropes around him. And as the Reverend Beck walked into the room, they pulled the body up in the bed with pulleys and ropes. What? And imagine the manhandling of the body in order to accomplish that. He said he nearly ran out of the room. He was horrified. It was horrifying.
It's like a horror movie. It is absolutely a horror movie to think about that.
And Bob was very, the other thing I wanted to say was that Bob was very meticulous. He was a bit OCD. Let's say that Bob was really OCD when it came to writing things down. Bob had a diary next to his bed, and we've seen it and held it, and it had blood all over it. But anything that happened in Bob's life was recorded. Bob recorded everything. Dinner conversations, watching, normal family things like Christmases and birthdays and holidays and whatever, driving down the street, going to the dentist.
And let's remind our audience that this is 1978. So he didn't have an iPhone in his back pocket.
Right.
No,
yes.
This is, if you see the photos of the crime scene, you will see cameras were bigger than computer monitors. They were like televisions.
Do we know the status of the case right now? Obviously, it's unsolved, but is it with a cold case unit? Can you tell us?
It's dormant. They have no intention of opening it back up. To them, they believe they found the right guy, and that's it. So it went cold, of course, for a long time after his murder, and they didn't find any evidence that they thought they could potentially use against John Henry Carpenter until 1992. And then they put him on trial around the same time that OJ was being chased down the streets in LA. I do remember that. However, they had made such a mess of the crime scene. They lost things. They couldn't prove it. Everything they had was completely circumstantial because they had zero physical evidence. But they insisted at that time, we had the right guy. This was the guy. And that was it. So there's no intention that we're aware of for them to reopen it. But there are at least 7 theories.
The only recent thing that happened was, again, I guess it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
There was a recent investigation into it because they discovered an old piece of dried blood from the rental car. And they tested it. And they were looking to see if they could find a match to Bob's blood, because it was Carpenter's rental car, and they wanted to see if Bob's blood was in that rental car, which would, in their mind, definitively prove that if there was Bob's blood in John Carpenter's rental car, then by all means he had to track it into the car with him, and that would solve it. And it came back, it was not Bob's blood type. They did a big, it was kind of like Al Capone's vault. They beefed it all up that, we solved the crime, we solved the crime, we solved the crime. And it turned out to be a big bust, and nothing came of it. And the only thing that did come of it was the Fox News anchor then wrote a book, which he stood on the shoulders of Robert Graysmith, who wrote the first book, The Murder of Bob Crane, back in the early 1990s. And did basically a criminology report of Bob's case. He had wanted to do the full biography, but his publisher said, nope, just do the case. And he even told us that the biography, a serious biography about Bob Crane, was very much needed. But the Fox News anchor just basically took what Robert Graysmith had already done, did his little bit of research, threw in his theories, and packaged it and put it out for sale. And, it is what it is. People are interested, but at the same time, it's really just a repackaging of Robert Graysmith's work with his spin on it. And there was no definitive answer as to whose blood that was or who killed Bob Crane. And at this point, sadly, I think, Linda, you agree that unless there's a deathbed confession or some huge piece of evidence that gets unearthed, I don't think the case will ever be solved. And unfortunately, because of that, Bob's going to continue to be made fun of and singled out and ridiculed and misunderstood. A certain movie released in the early 2000s did not help. That movie is nothing but lies and misinformation, and it was intentionally made to be a distortion of Bob's life. talking about the film Autofocus, people who tell us, well, just watch Autofocus because that'll tell you everything you need to know about Bob Crane. It tells you absolutely nothing about Bob Crane, to the point where Bob's first son, Robert, who participated in the film and who helped drive the film, actually was quoted as saying Autofocus is Paul Schrader's take at that time, on that time. In fact, he's not really interested in my dad much. And as he stated, it's a movie. It's not the Bob Crane biography. That movie has done more damage to Bob Crane's reputation and legacy than anything else. And it's a real crying shame that movie stands out as the go-to piece of information that people say, oh yeah, I saw that movie about him. Oh, he was a creep. When in fact, Paul Schrader says most of the material that came out of that film, the good Bob, the bad, bad Bob wasn't, good Bob wasn't as interesting as bad Bob. And, he goes on to just completely go through and say, this is a direct quote, in Crane's particular case, you have someone whose life would not really be worth examination. It was neither entertaining nor educational, were it not for a couple of events. John Carpenter was a part of Crane's life, but not that big a part, really. You're taking a smaller part of his life and putting it in the forefront because it was the most important thing that happened to him. And that's Paul Schrader, the director, telling you about his film, which is a complete sham. And yet everybody sees that and says, yep, that's Bob Crane and he was a creep.
It's just another tragic part to Bob's story, and how sad so many decades later. Thank you seriously for everything you have both shared. If you would like to, please tell our listeners where they can find you. Where can they find your book?
Yes, it's Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography. We have a website where you can find all of our information. We have a couple of podcasts that we produce. We haven't produced a lot lately just because there's been so much going on. But our website is vote4bobcrane.org. That's vote4bobcrane.org. And the reason it is Vote for Bob Crane is that we also are very heavily involved in petitioning the Radio Hall of Fame for his induction into the Radio Hall of Fame for all of his unprecedented work in radio, which actually goes for, he started in 1956, in 1950, and he goes all the way through 1965, and then he stays in radio for his entire life, always kind of going back into it, doing so many wonderful things in radio, plus all of his charity work as well. And so it's vote4bobcrane.org. You can find us there, find everything you need there. And I hope everybody takes some time to learn about Bob Crane as who he really was as a complete and total human being.
What a pleasure to speak with both of you today. Thank you so much for your time. I am just so honored to have had this conversation with you guys.
Thank you both so very, very much. Very much.
Make sure you follow us on all of our socials at the Murder Diaries Pod. And until then,
Stay safe.
bye.